Hello, hello. Mm. I'll just begin by thanking Tanya for a wonderful tournament. It was a pleasure and an honor debating with you, and congratulations to both of us. Okay. We have the bulldog of innovation time on our side. Risk happens, humans die, things are going to change. We don't know what's going to occur in the next hundreds of years, but I think that regardless of what ends up happening, it favors the OG case. Very simple idea we're going to put forward before you. Firstly, is that as time moves on, populations are going to decrease. And secondly, as time moves on, innovation in plant-based alternatives will also increase, which will outcompete the meat industry. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is why populations are decreasing. I want you to take a look at the countries that are above the replacement rate. It is incredibly bleak, right? Most countries across the world are below that two-child per woman average that is necessary to maintain replacement rate. And most projections of population peak well before 2100. Note that as nations continue to develop, they're going to have less and less births because of advances in contraception, women's rights, access to abortion, et cetera, et cetera. Notably, the largest increases in population are going to be concentrated in India, which is predominantly vegetarian due to the dominance of Hinduism in India. But it's so what you should take away from this is that population, generally is
Points.
increase. That decrease means there's going to be less people, less demand for meat, so on and so forth. But it's not just the population effects, it's also random chance, right? We see an incredible amount of tension in the status quo. I think that, one-off events that could be devastating to human populations are well within the realm of possibility in the next 100 years. I'm talking about an AI singularity, whatever that might look like, a pandemic that is able to take out large chunks of the human race, a climate crisis where many people, especially large urban centers on those coastlines that are so vulnerable, start dying off, or people start suffering from droughts, people start suffering from disease, people start suffering from political instability or climate refugeeism. All of these things are incredibly harmful. I think the additional probability of war, of nuclear weaponry, of new biotechnology and bioweaponry and bioterrorism, all of these potential harms, things that I think have a decent amount, decent likelihood of actually occurring, and people are generally scared of, these all help our side. It all demonstrates that there is likelihood that there's going to be more instability, less population, less demand. So there's going to be less consumption of meat. Notably, two things here. We have number one, population dynamics on our side, and we also have random chance on our side. Before I go on, I'll take the cuck.
Yeah, so the place of the highest population growth is not India, it's sub-Saharan Africa, a place that is A, not Hindu, and B, is the most religious place on earth, meaning birth rates are unlikely to fall there in the future.
I think that in many religious communities, birth rates have fallen for other reasons. Once people get access to contraception, once people notice that they're not, having high infant mortality rates, generally people do not continue to have 4 or 5 kids average. Okay. Secondly, the popular support for factory farming is waning, both on the individual and political level. On the individual level, youth are increasingly going vegetarian or vegan for ethical or climate reasons. They feel like it is their duty. It's something that they can do to actually make a difference in the world. And there's a lot of messaging around that fact. Secondly, is that images and art around animal suffering and the effects of eating meat are spreading at unprecedented rates because of increased access to things like social media and messaging and narratives that spread much quicker. Thirdly, is that there's just some level of contagion and exponential growth here. If you have one vegan friend in a community, that vegan friend will bring all of their non-vegan friends to dinner, and then you are probably going to see a lot more plant-based alternatives being at that dinner. There's people going to try and include those other individuals. And what ends up happening is that over time, people end up making more conscious decisions just by virtue of having one individual being vegetarian, which means that there's an exponential effect to all of this. Secondly, is on the political level. Factory farming is very risky. It's risky because you're consolidating animals in an incredibly small space, which causes risk of disease. And this has happened many, many times before. In the UK, we saw mad cow disease spread throughout, causing mass amounts of panic, both on the people eating meat level, but also on the governmental level about the regulations behind this. Just recently in the United States, because of factory farming amongst chickens, a large flu was spreading around, chickens and factory farms, which led to a skyrocketing egg prices, which is incredibly politically unpopular. So it's within the political interest to ensure that you have some level of spreading out and not engaging in the most extreme forms of factory farming. But on top of that, you also have the problems with antibiotic resistance, because as factory farms try and prevent disease from occurring, they give a huge amount of indiscriminate antibiotics, and they don't target it because that takes a lot of time and a lot of specificity that they don't have. And this is very bad for many reasons. The most notable of which is that you create antibiotic resistance, and as antibiotic resistance continues to become a threat, for example, tuberculosis is becoming less able to be treated by traditional antibiotics. You're going to see that politicians and governments start taking more of a harsh stance on this type of use of antibiotics. What you should take away from this is that there's less support on the political and individual level for factory farming, and that on the whole, demand for meat is actually decreasing over time. The main thrust of our case, however, is that innovation will solve, right? So I want to note that currently we're seeing massive amounts of innovation in lab grown and meats and plant-based alternatives. Why is this the case? Well, number one is that innovation acts exponentially. So one discovery builds upon another discovery, builds upon another. And over time, you make things more efficient. One lab learns from what worked in another lab, and they implement that, and they might add something to it that makes the process a little bit cheaper, a little bit faster, a little bit tastier. This leads to another exponential effect of innovation. This is why, for example, technology prices went from, $10,000 for a TV to like $200 for a TV today. There's an exponential growth in the quality of the innovation, but also the cost it takes to create it. Secondly, is that there's a huge amount of cost of competition. Beyond Beef, Gusta, all of these corporations are competing against one another. Lastly, is that lab-grown meat is just inherently cheaper. There's a much lower floor to the cost of lab-grown meat. It doesn't require space to raise. You don't have to raise an animal for their whole life. And plants are just more efficient because they get their energy directly from the sun instead of an animal that takes their energy from a plant. And just adding a step makes the process less efficient. So overall, you end up with alternatives that are as good, they are cheaper, and they are more abundant, and they are more politically expedient. I think not just the effects of birth, but also the current effects of political, trends, and also the competition and innovation we're seeing in the plant-based alternative industry. These all mean that OG clearly wins this debate. Proud.
I would like to thank the speaker for that speech and call upon the first speaker on opening opposition.
In the next 75 years, a lot of things can change. But what really cannot change is the fact that we are rapidly popularizing, and that the world has a very consistent and very justifiable demand for cheap food, and that often happens through the form of factory farms. Proud to oppose. What am I going to do in this speech? Firstly, framing, then two arguments. Why animal factory produce will increase over the next century and not halve instead, and also talking about the irrevocable consumer interest in factory farming and why that will not go away, despite what they say about politician rhetoric and how there are lab issues, etc., etc. Okay, on framing, 2 points. Firstly, the motion says by the year 2100, which is the next 75 years change. When they talk about AI singularity or how they can have rapid growth and lab development of lab-grown meat, I want you to do a gut check reaction about the next 75 years and whether or not we actually have the ability and the actual faculties to handle that as well. But secondly, an important characterization, meat and produce from factory farms exists everywhere in the world. It is not just unique to developed nations like the US US and Sweden and Singapore. Many countries have their own ability to have factories because they can have AC access and do temperature control, which means that everybody has the ability to produce artificially. That means that even if higher like first world nations like the US or Sweden opt out of factory farming, which is their best case scenario, 3 other developing nation countries can take your place to fill the consumer gap because there needs to be a collective opting out by all of these countries, or else there's just simply be an increasing expansion from lesser developed nations to continuously fill the consumer need for this food that happens in many different countries, not just 1 or 2 in the EU or by the Western world as well. Okay, on to the first argument then. Why factory produce will increase over the next century instead of decreasing. The first thing to note underneath this is that there's a rapid dwindling of earth and land resources. Well, I want to note to you that overpopulation, this is for 2 reasons. One, overpopulation is surging in many developing countries. Countries like India, China, Botswana, humongous populations that require meat and animal produce. Why is this so? Because of 2 reasons. One, it is just simply the most accessible. Like I told you, many nations can do factory farming. It is not that hard to do. It is pretty accessible as long as you have a plot of land that you can control over time. But 2, it's just relatively cheaper. Because it is on a mass level of scale, this means that people have easy access to things like dairy, eggs, and milk, which I think are good things, not things that we should abandon and try to do a 180 on, especially if you are in a developing nation. That means one thing. Demand exists and will surge over time as populations in these countries continue to surge and grow. They give you examples of like how the US is decreasing in population, but that is not good enough. They need to prove to you why overall in this entire world, why these countries are actually slowing down when that simply isn't the case. And many other nations, not just those in the Western world, are those who are entering stage 2 and 3 of the population growth and are actually surging in population demand as well. We also think that this results in less open land or waters to farm on to begin with. They're all going instead to developments of housing or shopping malls as people find ways to settle down and want to spend more of their open consumer demand on, which means that even if populations are dwindling, there's more consumer demand for things outside of factory farming or non-factory farming, which means that the possible land that you can use is just simply not going to be there. Secondly, and very, very crucially, climate change is the reason why factory farming will still exist and persist in the next 75 years. We think that the world is undergoing geographical shifts that inherently deter shifting away from meat and produce. Why is that so? One, there's just a lack of land available in developing countries or rural land because it is all exhausted or heavily volatile land. There's an inability to climate control or predict seasons of what produce relies on or what season will be, what temperature, what Celsius, because thinking about fish wetlands or grazing fields for cows that they rely on now no longer exist or can be burnt to a crisp because of the record high temperatures that we're experiencing because of climate change. That means that for most factory corporations and farm owners, they have no choice but to turn to factory farming because it is the most guaranteed, most consistent way to control their crop and make sure that they have stable returns over time. That is exactly why, because of climate change, people just not make the jump to doing more audacious, more like tech savvy things because they just simply don't have the resources or the time to do so. The impact of this argument is very simple. Shifting away is 2 things. One, heavily unprofitable for suppliers because they do not want to get outcompeted and they know that if they do shift away to free roam farming, they're going to go out of business. But secondly, it's strongly unwanted by demand in other countries. That means people don't really care. They care about mostly having a cheap and reliable source of these meats, about these dairy as well. Note that many farm corporations are already dwindling in population. Another note that I want to give to you. People are moving out of the rural lands. There's less attractive jobs of being a farmer, and people want to go into higher education, like getting a grad degree instead. That means that these farmer companies have less manpower to begin with, which means that if you want to do free roam farming, looking over 10,000 chickens at once, you can't do that with like 5 guys left in your farm. You need to rely on factories for efficiency and automation as well. So with all this being said, how do we weigh this argument? If consumer interests are uncertain, if AI singularity is uncertain, the only thing that we know in the future is that Earth's resources are zero sum and corporations are profit driven. This is the most concrete thing that we can rely on in the round. We know that because of this, having the factory farm population is way too ambitious and way too high of a goal for the next 75 years. This leads me to my second point then. Interest in factory farms will just simply not exist. But who won? I'll take that point.
Right, so if you concede that global north countries would innovate, aren't global south countries the ones most directly hit by climate change and they won't be incentivized to invest in factory farming?
Okay. 2 responses, I don't concede that, but 2, even if the global south are hit most directly, they care about sustenance more. I'm going to expand on that. 3 things under consumer interest. 1, moral reckonings are just so far away. Note that underneath this, the shift away from climate change rhetoric by politicians and the rise of right-wing populism, particularly those aligned with the rural lower class, is extremely on the rise. The youth are in fact not going vegan, but becoming mukbangers. They just simply don't care about climate change anymore. They'd rather be gluttonous and spend money on things that make them happy, that social media feeds them as well. But secondly, and very importantly, corporations will reinforce the legitimacy of meat in factory farms because they have immense control of the media and pop culture. Like I said, mukbangs, like I said, McDonald's and Arby's, like I said, literally look at the US and Raising Cane's. Everybody relies on cheap, delicious, crispy, fried food and chicken coming and sourced from factory farms. And because corporations are having the most control over how to like bankroll corporations, what ads to put to you on YouTube, that is exactly why the youth do not care at all about factory farms and will continue to do so so long as corporations stay wealthy. But thirdly, factory farmers are viewed as morally permissible, and that people overlook the fact that they abuse animals because they have other moral reasons. AKA, food is a form of sustenance. We rely on food to survive ourselves, and it also is a form of religious or spiritual enjoyment. That is an inalienable right. That is exactly why we can overlook the fact that chickens are being slaughtered in these houses because we want to feed ourselves and make our family happy as well. That is exactly why, when you weigh this argument, even if populations decrease in the future, taking them at their very best case, your taste for factory produce will not. That means that even if the tech push is not on food, it will be instead of on other things like AI singularity, but cutting edge things that people would really care about more and actually what they're putting on their plates because they're pretty content with that right now. For all these reasons, people are not going vegan, they're watching mukbang. We're very happy to oppose.
I would like to thank the speaker for that speech and call upon the second speaker on opening government.
All right, am I visible and audible? I'm gonna assume yes.
Yes.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, of course, I'd like to thank Humam as well. Goat partner, Goat MDU debater. Big fan of Humam. All right. Okay, I want to start by saying that the endpoint of our case is that plant-based alternatives and lab-grown meats will become much cheaper than factory-farmed meat because plants are easier to produce than raising an animal, and Humam already illustrated this for you. We outlined that the demand for these alternatives exists, a profit incentive to create this exists, and that the existing competition and innovation in this new growing vegan, like plant-based alternatives industry means that it is incredibly likely that lab-grown meat will outcompete factory farm in the next few decades. And I'm going to go a little bit into exactly what this looks like. First, I want to say that on innovation of other meat sources, we need to prove that there is incentive to increase in lab-grown meats, and there's capability to do this. On incentive, profit and demand is growing. This is because activism against the ethics of factory farming is growing. Political activism is becoming more progressive with this stuff. OO tries to tell you that the youth is continuing to eat meat and is not buying into veganism. This is just not true. I think veganism and specifically opposing factory farming is a big part of a lot of liberal pushes that are going on all over the world. And I think that it's like pretty obvious that people are buying more into veganism, especially as options increase, options for vegan meats and proteins increase. Additionally, I want to flag that like FDA regulations on like how many drugs can be used on these things, the quality of water that fish are farmed in, how many like antibiotics and stuff that factory farmers can use is growing. Even people who aren't vegan have growing concerns about like people like parents and more traditionalist people. There's growing concerns about how food is often very processed, how meat is often very drugged and very full of like things that they don't want. And so there's increasing demand and political lobbying for the FDA as well as for other like regulation things to like add regulations on exactly what can be like what drugs can be used in this thing, and there's more push towards like more natural foods. So even those who eat meat are trying to turn towards more sustainable methods and more plant-based options. This reduces the demand for factory farming even further because it's now more expensive because they now can't shove everyone into like shove all these like fish into like very polluted and very cheap water, and they now have to take more precautions, making it a worse industry to go into and making vegan and plant-based foods a better industry to go into, given that demand, even among people who still eat meat, is growing. Yeah, so I think that like adequately proves that there's growing demand for plant-based meat sources, that there's a profit incentive here for companies to go into making more plant-based meat sources. And then on capability, I think Humam already illustrated for you some very good points on technology, capital, and like economies of scale just allowing for this to happen. OO tries to tell you to gut check that in 75 years, technology won't allow you to make good like plant-based meat sources. I'm not sure like what gut check you're meant to derive from this. I think it's very real with the increase of technology, with the increase of capabilities, and with the increase of research into these plant-based alternatives. I think it is very easy and very possible for economies of scale to allow innovation to like just exponentially grow. Innovation like this is scalable because since there's a market for it right now among vegans and among people trying to become more vegan and plant-based, then like this is only going to grow by these companies further promoting this demand, further promoting advertising, things like the Impossible Burger, things like being like, look how good this plant-based meat tastes, taking advantage of free market and economies of scale to really push innovation to its maximum and get the like vegan plant-based meat industry to grow, thereby further reducing demand for factory farmed meats. Lastly, I just want to say that the cost of lab-grown meat is much cheaper on space, not needing to feed them, not needing to raise them, etc. You simply have to grow the meat in the lab. You simply have to like get the plants together and like make it or whatever. I think this contributes to the exponential growth of the plant-based meat industry just because of the fact that since it's cheaper to go into and with increasing regulations on factory farming and with increasing opposition to factory farming by like activists and similar things, I think that the industry for lab-grown meat can only grow exponentially given that it's much cheaper and much more profitable to go into. I'll take a POI from closing.
Yeah, so given that people don't like processed stuff, are people going to trust meat from a lab or meat from a field more?
Okay, this is just like genuinely on like free market economies. Companies that make plant-based meat are obviously going to advertise it in a way that makes them a lot of profit. So look at this plant-based meat that is so healthy for you, that comes from nature, that comes from plants. I don't think this makes it necessarily more processed. And with an increase in information and with an increase in like people using the internet and learning what factory farming really entails, I don't think it is crazy to say that people will understand that factory farming and the things that are put into animals during factory farming and like the stress hormones produced and whatever are probably worse for them than like a burger made out of black beans. I don't necessarily think that lab-grown meats necessarily equals process. And I think for all the reasons we've given you on why this economy is going to grow exponentially, that's even more reason to believe that it's going to have more options. They're going to have good ways to like frame these options and that people are probably going to buy into it. I now want to go into some ref on OO, which I've already done a little. First of all, can we handle more lab-grown meat in 75 years with the way technology develops and with this profit incentive? Absolutely. They tell you that factory farming is incredibly accessible and cheap and it can like economies of scale can be taken advantage of. But I just explained to you why we also access economies of scale to a greater extent and why factory farming is increasingly becoming more expensive comparative to the innovation with regards to plant-based meats. They tell you that lots of land in like developing countries is inaccessible and climate change is unpredictable. And this is why like people are going to turn towards factory farming. But I think this is pretty symmetric on both sides, given that establishing new factory farms in places where land is inaccessible and climate change is unpredictable is also pretty hard. I think if anything, being able to access plants and being able to access, like I think a lot of plant-based meats are also made from plants that are pretty easy to access and can grow almost anywhere. Things like potatoes, things like corn, things like beans. I think this actually makes plant-based meats more accessible to make and these industries more common. Lastly, on this clash about like how populations rise over time and like more people will just want more meat. First, I want to say that one of the biggest growing populations in the world, which is India and Southeast Asia, has a large population of Hindus and Buddhists. Sumam already said this. They're largely vegetarian. We don't need to worry about that. This at the very least mitigates like more than half of Gov's impact on like population growth. With regards to sub-Saharan Africa, I think people still being religious and reproducing, sure, but they're also developing rapidly to be more like the West. It's unclear that plant-based alternatives can't make its way down there with the increased development of sub-Saharan Africa. Additionally, lots of traditional and historically religious societies often have standards for how their meat is produced, and so they might not even necessarily buy into factory farming and would rather consume meat on like their own terms in like local farms and stuff. I think this is a very strong point. Clear government win in this debate. Very proud to propose.
I would like to thank the speaker for that speech and call upon the second speaker on opening opposition.
Three, two, one. kind of firstly a couple of refutation. Firstly, on the entire like India being vegetarian thing, right? I come from Nepal, my family is vegetarian. What I would like to say here is the meat that is being produced right now does not go to India regardless, right? The 100% of the produce that's happening right now, it goes to Africa, it goes to the West, it goes to people that actually consume it and not India. So the fact that India's population increases alongside Africa's population does not matter in this debate because sure, vegetarian population increases, but so does the non-vegetarian population, right? Like, I don't know why Gov is so dialed in on this fact. Secondly, I think Gov also has a huge misunderstanding on how plant-based meats work. It's not corn and potatoes that give you plant-based meat. It's plants that have like the same chemical compound that meat does, which is plants like soybean, which are not as readily available and produced in a large scale as other of these cash crops. Why is this very important? First, when you have an animal farm that's industrialized, like very industrial animal farm, what happens is these animals are not fed like the best food in the world. What they're fed is you produce rice on another farm, whatever is left over, the shitty parts that people don't eat, that's given to these animals. It's a very efficient system that utilizes every single resource that you have very efficiently, right? This is what these corporations care about. They have zero waste that goes, right? Whatever they invest in getting rice, they use that and they invest in getting meat, right? This is a very efficient and very cheap system. My partner tells you that this is also much more accessible because you don't need to have like a very ideal environment for this to exist, right? This can happen anywhere, right? And for like let's say like okay, sure, you can grow like soybean at a very large scale and a very fast rate. You still need fertile land that allows the soybean to grow, which which clashes with already existing farmlands, right? You're not going to cut rice, you're not going to cut wheat. You are going to have to take land that is grown for meat, which is already infertile, right? You need access to large fertile lands for this ideal world in which you can largely produce alternative plant-based meat that side up government so wants. That is very unrealistic because firstly, a lot of land in the world is getting unfertile due to climate change, due to a lot of existing issues and a lot of like millennia of farming on them, right? Land loses their nutrients. Even if you argue that okay, yeah, you can use fertilizers, etc., etc., we still tell you that a lot of these resources, a lot of these uh, uh, like even if at their best case scenario you can increase like the amount of plant-based meat that you get, while my partner tells you that the amount of people that actually crave like actual real meat is not going to decrease. Why? There's already existing industries on like factory produced meat and they're getting a lot of profit and it's a very reliable and stable consumer base, right? If these corporations, like the fact is that these corporations are very profit driven and very profit based, right? If plant-based alternatives were so easy to produce and would be able to scale so rapidly, these corporations would already be investing billions of dollars into making this already if they thought this was a very sustainable way to go. But the fact is these types of research don't get as much funding as AI singularities or things like making GPU farms all over the world because those give them much more profit, right? All of these industries, the fact is you have a very reliable consumer base that is poor people, right? This is also another main point that side opening opposition does not clash with, which is the main consumer base for like industrial meat is poor people, right? These are people that actively go to like ShopRite and get spam. These are people that actively go to like places where you get cheap meat for very cheap because that's the only meat option that they can afford, right? That's the only food that they can afford. And the fact that meat is represented as such a good source of protein, as a staple in your diet, also it reinforces the fact that people are not likely to switch away from meat in any near future, right? The fact that these corporations lobby these governments and also the entire point on like FDA regulations increasing, I don't know what they're on about. Trump just removed like shit ton of FDA regulations for corporations and his lobbyists. And the fact is like the government is not going to anytime soon like decrease FDA regulations in these meat companies because they are a very reliable source of income for all the lobbyists and people that own these corporations, right? Lastly, they also don't talk about the fact that there's not a lot of manpower that you can use. Like the alternative to like meat, like industrial meat is free range meat, right? For people that actually do want to eat meat. And that firstly is very expensive to maintain and very expensive to sell, which already does not have a lot of population. Lastly, what I like to say is veganism is a privilege. It's privilege for people that can actually afford it. If you're not in India or Nepal or like any place that's majorly Hindu or Buddhist, the fact is if you go to Europe or China or any other place, it's so hard to find vegan food and it's so expensive, right? That already deters people from accessing vegan food in the first place. And even if we are to say, okay, sure, vegan food will increase like in like certain amount of time, it's still the fact that the deterrence that exists right now is going to bar people from opting into vegan food. Why does this matter now? And why is the industrial meat farms not going to decrease in like the next 70 years, right? Firstly, they need to tell you that poor people would get another alternative source for like their food besides from meat, and they tell you that it's plant-based meat, and but there's a lot of holes in their argument that they cannot sufficiently prove, right? You need to prove that it's very sustainable to grow soybeans. I'll take your POI.
Right.
Compared to planting acres of beans, it is incredibly expensive and inefficient to provide food and water for an animal for months, take care of them, and you only end up eating half. Lab-grown meat will inevitably outcompete factory farms on price.
No, okay. The thing is, the meat that is given to you is not good meat. Like the fact is, like they give you bones, they give you shit. Like they don't feed these animals well. They feed them waste. They feed them plants that are not being eaten by humans, and that's the point. It's not good meat, but it's cheap. And that's what the main point is, right? Corporations don't care if you are healthy or not healthy if you eat that meat because they also gain profit from you being sick and going to healthcare. What they care about is making the most cheap system to make this meat, give it to you, and then gain profit from it, right? The fact that this industry coexists with so many other industries and is actively benefited by all of them means that these corporations are not going to switch to plant-based meat anytime soon. And the fact is, if these corporations are not going to switch to plant-based meat anytime soon, veganism and alternative plant-based meat is always going to remain a privilege as long as it does not switch on mass scale, which from the scenario, like from current status quo and from like the deterrence from climate awareness, from deterrence of people to opting into like all the protein craze, gym craze, right? All of these different narratives that coexist alongside the current status quo deters people away from like massively co-opting veganism. And as long as they cannot prove to you that everyone in the world can co-opt veganism to the point that half of the world goes vegan immediately, these industries are not going anywhere. That's the burden of proof that side opposition has. And as long as they cannot prove to you that half the demand is just going to disappear in the next 70 years, they cannot prove to you that the industrial lab-grown meat is going to decrease by 50%. Very proud to propose. Lastly, food is a very essential resource. Everything else will get cut off before food gets cut off because it's a very important part of sustaining life. With that, vote opening opposition here.
I would like to thank the speaker for that speech and call upon the first speaker on CG.
Give me just 1 second. Okay, am I visible and audible?
Yes, you are.
Great, thank you. To prove that the number of animals in factory farms will have fallen to less than half of today's total, we need to prove that the supply of animals in these conditions will be cut in half. And to do that, we need to prove that we will see an unignorable decrease in demand over the next 75 years. OO tells us that there's less open land to farm to begin with. First, you can easily imagine that this just means less meat, not more, as the OGPOI suggests. But then second panel, more factory farms exist than free-range farms in the status quo. And there's already large amounts of stress for housing units, building space, yet this persists. People continue to support this, and these businesses thrive because they offer something different that people are willing to pay slightly more for. I think that how the world is operating now sufficiently supports this conclusion. So moving on, and I'll continue to do rebuttal throughout my speech, we have two main pushes. First, on consumer preferences. There are stirrings that suggest it's principally wrong to rely so heavily on animals, and it's only reasonable to predict that this will incite a drop of consumerism. We've already talked about this a bit in opening, so I'll stay away from it. But like, just to cover my bases, countries like Australia recognizing legal personhood for animals, global shifts towards vegetarianism or no meat Mondays, different days, for reasons of things like nonviolence, anti-cruelty, which OG highlights. But what they don't talk enough about is this idea of climate change, or this presence of climate change, really. Like, me having a vegetarian friend who I love and admire is not enough for me to convert my meat-eating ways. I have friends who are vegetarian, but I'm still not giving up meat. Why? Because one, meat tastes good. Two, because my family eats it. I grew up with this diet. If I had kids, probably I would want them to try my favorite recipes too, once they're old enough to chew it. And then, like, also, In terms of climate change, this is a very powerful mechanism because as climate change gets noticeably worse, more intense hurricanes, tsunamis, droughts, heat waves, earthquakes that destroy actual people's lives, homes, flood their streets, keep them from going to work because they can't drive on the road that's covered in 3 to 5 feet of water, or lead friends to suffer lethal heat strokes that they visit them in the hospital, that they see in real life. People will become more and more aware of what they can do to mitigate their own environmental impact. Like, for example, in recent years, airplanes giving you the opportunity to offset your CO2 costs, people putting solar panels on houses, and electric companies actually buying the surplus that those solar panels create in terms of energy, the rise of climate vegetarianism that we've already, expressed and talked about. But as it becomes more proximate to your own life, this is what I really want to stress here. You are more and more disturbed by the impacts of climate change over time as it gets more and more proximate to your life. It's different when you see charts on the news or you hear about numbers versus when you see flooded cities and wildfires week after week after week, and it hits you that it hits your family in Oklahoma, for example. Sorry, Elaine. Also see Walmart opposing climate change when their own warehouses were getting destroyed by heat waves and they had to call their workers and tell them to go home. In 2020, we surpassed the point of reversal. So we know that this is likely to only get worse. And I think that more and more people are going to ask, what can we do over time? Why are they likely to find vegetarianism as something that they say, okay, I can do this? First, there's so much data on it, but then second, importantly, it takes an amount of restraint to be vegetarian. So people who do it feel that they have to have done it for a good reason, especially if they opted in later in life rather than were just raised that way, and are likely to be out about their experience or to talk about what was difficult, what was also very beneficial, or what made them feel good about their choices. Yeah, I'll take your point.
Yeah, great. They can mitigate their impact by moving from larger animals like cow that emit methane to smaller animals like shrimp and chicken. This massively increases the number of animals that are factory farmed.
Yeah, actually, I'm going to get to that in a second, but I'll skip right to it. So on the status of fish, this is our second push, and I'll jump back a bit in a moment to the first push because I have a few more things to say. But on the status of fish is already seen as, okay, so a big reason that so much factory farming is happening right now is that seafood or sea pollution is viewed as irreversible. So fish have to be factory farmed. Why is this likely to change over time? Two main reasons. First, this how fish are viewed by the consumer. Fish is already seen as either a geocultural staple or a luxury to an extent. What do I mean by this? For island or sea adjacent nations, it's a cultural staple. The fishing culture has been passed down for years. Tourists enjoy this food either in the country itself or shipped there as a luxury item. This is not and this is usually not done as factory farming, right? This is more where you see sea boats kind of floating around Lake Geneva in Switzerland. Okay, then second, anytime you go to a restaurant or a grocery store, unless you are on an island, in which case, again, it's not factory farming, seafood is more expensive than red or white meat. Consider prawns, scallop, shrimp, king crabs, even salmon. And this is a luxury meat. So if the population is increasing in mostly poorer places, opening half would like to push, we're going to see less and less factory fish farming because there's when people do need subsistence, as we've talked about in OG and OO, they're going to opt for cheaper meats that are not as good quality, but also that just are more for your buck. And then also people want good quality fish. Cross apply my points on consumer preference. But second, I think that this is likely to decrease because people really love the ocean. Anytime you've opened any of your social media apps, I guarantee you've seen people, in their bikinis posing in front of some body of water. I think that we're very disturbed by the idea that we could not enjoy this later on. And I think that humans are quite selfish, but also just as we see now, there are already marine biology units who have micro-engineered tiny organisms that eat sea pollution over time, and that it will become safer and safer to fish in more areas, both because there's a huge profit incentive, but also because, again, people like the ocean and are willing to fight for it. Okay, jumping back up to my first point and talking now again about consumer preferences, but not on climate change, instead on health awareness. I want to talk about red meat because, again, it does produce a lot of methane, lots of pollution pushed out. The majority of protein farmed in factories at this moment is red meat. We also see more and more people around the world are struggling with conditions such as irritable bowel syndrome, IBS, or negative gut health conditions that lead to really uncomfortable bloating, sickness, etc. because of all the processed food that we increasingly subject our bodies to. This is not unlikely to change. People like colored snacks, and colored food dye is just not good for us, etc. Many more ingredients, yada, yada. One, this condition is something that doctors have not yet been able to treat, especially because of how the food culture is changing. And then two, red meat is horrible for IBS. So people who increasingly get diagnosed with gut health issues are encouraged to stay away from this by their medical doctors because they're in literal stomach pain from consuming it. And so they're likely to shift away. But then also on this transmitting disease, we're going to bring something that no other team has talked about yet. This is the increasing prominence of antibiotic resistant bacteria over time, which poses a huge issue to contemporary medicine. So even if you say, say, oh, like, they're like transmitting diseases. It's not going to be that bad. There's ways to, but like these bacteria are more and more likely to be like, you're not going to kill them with whatever you evolve. And also in these close quarters, more and more of these bacteria are going to get more and more resistant, which is just what we've seen over the last 10 years, lots of medical concern on this. And then finally, red meat consumption, even for the average person, not seen as healthy. So if you can opt differently, you will. And in terms of this, it's like Fitness or Vogue magazines highlighting a white meat diet. So like your white suburban moms are not going to eat it in general. They ignored fish, they ignored climate change, they ignored seafood. We don't vote CG.
I would like to thank the speaker for that speech and call upon the first speaker on closing opposition.
Mizzy, am I audible?
Yep.
Great. I'm sorry for this. I got to do a little introduction. I got a little thing. I want to thank my wonderful partner, Amelia, for doing strong with me. I think she's been a great partner. And allowed us to run the best team name of all time. Yeah. I also want to thank my boy Anders. I want to thank Kira, and I want to thank Kumam. Love you, Humi. Great. So 3, 2, 1. I think OG clearly beats OO here. I don't think OO actually deals with the rise of lab or plant-grown meat in an effective way. It's pretty clear it can use less space, and if fully allowed to innovate, can become cheaper. We're still going to beat it. On CG, factory farm fish is produced because it's cheaper, not because the ocean is bad. And yes, emissions are the issue, right? They're going to move towards cheaper meat. Notably, they give a lot of analysis on like they won't eat fish, but they give 0 on why people won't move towards chicken. If more people eat more chicken instead of cow, as you should believe from their case, this makes every consumer 10 times as worse, because every consumer of chicken products kills multiple chicken to get that product. If you consume beef, you can all share one larger cow. Ergo, you should believe from their own case that the number of animals goes up. It's just smaller animals. Given this motion treats a cow and a chicken equally, this flip should be enough to win us the debate itself. Great. Let's explain why lab-grown meat will not succeed, or plant-grown meat, whatever. So firstly, I think lab-grown meat is already seeing bans in the United States already. There are many red states doing this. Beyond Meat is empirically going bankrupt. It's very difficult for companies to do this. This is mostly because there are issues with price in the short term. It's unclear if in the short term this is good things to invest in, because in the foreseeable future it will not be cheaper, and so it has a very, very niche audience. This means you're probably just not going to get a lot of good investment, and maybe if it's really invested over a very long period of time, it's going to become cheaper. But like the investment needs to be happen now, and it's not happening now because it's way more expensive now. I think secondly, there's just an anti-medicine hysteria, there's an anti-sort of FDA hysteria. We see like the health secretary being an anti-vaxxer, the rise of anti-vax, and the rise of sort of traditional sort of raw milk stuff. And that's it. But in a lot of places, people don't trust the medical establishment. This is a growing trend. OG says people don't like meat because it's processed. We believe this meat is likely perceived as much more processed because meat produced in a lab is literally meat that is produced from culturing cells. The same way cancer happens, where cells spontaneously develop. It looks really fucking scary, and then people look at this and be massively turned off from it. I think plant-grown meat is not really a big threat. I also think like is a pretty massive bias against what is seen as unnatural. It seems to only accelerate. I think in terms of plant-grown meat itself, I think this is just not, it first of all does not taste right, but secondly, people psyop themselves into thinking it does not taste like. And thirdly, there is a culture war against this. It seems like an attack on farmers, an attack on the masculine red state Republican right-wing agenda to push sissy, weak, woke meat. And that's why states are banning plant-based meat. That's why states are doing things like this. Firstly, let's deal with the argument that OG gives us on reform by saying like EA will likely take over veganism. I think EA is a really powerful movement, has a lot of very smart people from a lot of big universities like Anders Woodruff involved with it. It is seen as a very practical movement that's focused on the pragmatic solutions rather than the principles. It is easy for the average person. They can still eat meat and just donate a little bit of money and feel good. There's insane amounts of corporate funding behind EA because it does not challenge the corporation's interests. It is not an anti-consumption movement. And fifthly, vegans appear very silly lots of the time. EA is very good at creating a slick environment. This is why EAs are likely to, in the long term, overtake veganism. Why is this really bad? EAs don't want to abolish factory farming generally. Mostly, the things they want to use to reform are slow reforms like corporate pledges. And the issue with corporate pledges, they're often broken. It is very difficult for EA to see what actually happens in these places, meaning the movement and the momentum for change gets taken to places where it's unlikely to do much difference. This cooks CG because it means the conspicuous consumers are consuming things that are not very good. But also, EA is not very culturally sensitive. So it means it's dominated by Western white people. It's not really, it's done by people in the West that aren't really familiar with the reforms that are being done. For example, EA lobbied for cage-free chickens in India. What happened was there was a cage-free regulation that created a standard of a large crate that was measured as the cage-free. So if your farm used a large crate for chickens, it was labeled as cage-free, meaning traditional Indian farmers had their product outcompeted by factory farms that used slightly bigger cages and treated their chickens horribly, meaning conspicuous consumers bought products that were crueler and contributed to even more factory farming. Thus, you should believe you get reform on government side, but the reform doesn't actually make factory farming end. Let's bring in our real real extension here, which is that economic growth in the developing world leads to more consumption of meat by far. So obviously, South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa are growing at an insane rate, both population and economically. Africa is due to hit 4 billion people by 2050, 4 billion. Given they are really young, they'll likely still be alive and consuming lots of meat by 2100. Even if they start having fewer and fewer kids, there will be tons and tons and tons, like 6 billion by 2100 people in Africa still consuming meat, still being religious, still doing all these things. There was none of the religions they have say you should eat meat. And on birth rates, in many places like Latin America and Israel have high population growth and high birth rates, despite being quite wealthy. Notably, come on.
Most of these countries are Muslims or Muslim countries. Muslims do not allow factory farming because you have to kill the animal in a halal way. Factory farms do not do that.
Yeah, there are lots of ways to get around this, lots of ways to have not halal forms of factory farming, lots of ways to sort of get around the rules. Obviously, people want cheap meat, and so they will produce it. Is the religion is not really that big of an issue. Also, lots of countries are Christian where it's totally fine. Notably, the big concern is that people in these countries are becoming much richer. So they're moving from agricultural economies where they don't make much money and often live in deep poverty to becoming quite wealthy individuals who live in urban areas that are allowed and able to buy things. This is incredibly important. Firstly, it's also happening culturally. So they're becoming more culturally secular. So many Muslims are becoming more okay with consuming meat that is not halal. Many people in India are okay with eating some sorts of meats. Many Indians consume chicken at a very large rate. Southeast Asia has lots of Muslim populations that do consume stuff like chicken, do consume this sort of meat, and it is often produced in this sort of way. Notably, Africa specifically is seeing lots of economic growth. OG literally concedes this, but it's true in Kenya, they're having domestic car brands. You're seeing Kigali, Rwanda becoming a world city. Kenya is a hub for fintech. Africa is seeing a ton of economic growth. People are moving from the countryside into big urban areas where they can work high productivity jobs and the economy grows. What is important about this? This means these people who are mostly vegetarian in the status quo because of necessity, because if you work in a farm, you can only eat meat a couple of times a year. Because it's very hard to get meat because meat is very expensive. When these people move to cities and people get more money, they're able to buy much more meat. And so the demand for meat skyrockets. When you move to a city, you can have meat a couple of days a week. You can eat all the time. It's really easy for you to do so. This means that when this happens, when the population grows, but also urbanization massively increases, the amount of people who are consuming meat skyrockets. I mean, every single individual in Africa consumes much more meat by the person, and also the population of the continent multiplies as well. Meaning you get a double multiplication effect, massively increasing the demand of meat in Africa to a ridiculous degree. Why does this win the debate? I think this just means that even if Gov proves that lab-grown meat takes on the first world, all sorts of stuff, I think respondents very well. It is just true that you have populations in the developed world that are growing super fast and having insatiable demand for lots and lots of meat products because they are moving to a place where they can afford it. People want meat when they can afford it because plants are cheaper, and meat tastes better. And so when these areas get richer, when people in them have more money to spend, they will buy more meat, and that is the actual reason we like to have this. When the population of Africa is 6 billion in 2100, when all these people consume meat a couple of days a week, it does not matter what happens in the West. It does not matter if there's slightly more vegans in 300 million population in America or in 400 million population in Europe. All that matters is these 6 billion people are consuming meat. I think we've clearly won their out.
I would like to thank the speaker for that speech and call upon the whip on CG.
Am I visible and audible?
Yes.
Perfect. Before I begin, just personal preference, please POIs in the chat, preferably after 5. If I don't take you by 5:30, you can go verbal, feel free. Right. I will start in 3, 2, 1. First panel, I want to tell you how we weigh over our opening. By 2 ways. First, by giving you a more realistic analysis of consumer preference. They give you good mechanizations about climate activism, about concerns about health, but I think both are mitigated to some extent by the odd bench because the scope isn't that big. Frankly, just not everyone is going to be super climate aware. Everyone's going to go vegan, etc. But I think the more realistic analysis is the impending effects of climate change, which is the second extension brought to you by Maya in her speech. And why is this more important? This impacts the most number of people, right? Particularly in the global south, but by 2100, it could trickle up to other more developed countries as well, which would literally force them to become more climate aware and to consider these lab-grown meat options, which means we access all of the OG innovation solve point, right? But also, Maya told you that climate change is proximately what impacts you, and this ties into our global south point, right? I think in the opening dialogue, there was one point I want to re-highlight. It's about the global north versus the global south and which side is more likely to adopt lab-grown meat, adopt innovations at a faster rate. I think at five, please. I think all teams agree that, Global North by 2100 with 75 years of development will probably be able to have these lab-grown meat. It will probably be able to have these innovations and not necessarily the Global South. However, the Global South being the most adversely hit by climate change, they are not going to, promote more factory farming and, further exacerbate climate change, knowing that, the floods, the droughts will hit them the hardest. A few mechanizations as to this, because in the first speech they talked about how sustenance is still the most important thing, right? I think first with more development, the global north can definitely aid the global south. We have international organizations like the World Food Bank, IMF, etc. Just helping global south with humanitarian aid, etc. Second, people in the global south knows that climate change destroys food security, right? Even more importantly than protein, than meat, it's like just fundamentally crops. They know that wildfires and all of these natural disasters destroy crops. So even if you buy their point about food insecurity and people starving in hunger, they are more incentivized to invest in green tech, invest in these lab grown plant-based alternatives, because they know that they will be hurt the most adversely if factory farming is continued, right? The second way that we weigh over our opening is on more crucial mechanizations for this plant-based alternative. They tell you it's cheaper, but I don't think their mechanizations stand as well against the op pushback, right? I think a crucial link that they miss is just simply more research. As climate change becomes more imminent, governments, think tanks, etc., they will pull more investment in research into lab-grown meats, and research is what will facilitate a few things. First, definitely price going lower, and second, activating their mechanization about better marketing so that people can better accept these alternatives, and third, no matter what the specific ingredient of these lab-grown meat is, make sure that they taste as close to meat as possible. They have the same level of nutrients, etc. Now moving on to OO, right? In their first point, they tell with geographical shifts, there's volatile land being burned, etc. Right? First, I think just cross-apply what I said earlier, that more aid goes to these countries, like we see in the status quo when Tuvalu was facing flooding, countries rally together to help them. But second, again, they're more climately aware. And a new mechanization being that many of them use their unique positions to ally with other well-developed nations, right? We see many oceanic countries allying with European countries like France to promote this climate awareness, to promote stopping sea pollution and stopping factory farming, etc. Then they tell you moral reckoning is so far away because first of all, youth doesn't care. I think this is pretty much a wash. You either believe youth care or doesn't. I think the OG points about social media, about just being more progressive, liberal does counteract this point pretty well. Quickly on their point about corporate legitimacy, I think corporates know that they will be targeted by media and they actually gain better PR if they support climate initiatives, right? One example is recently Starbucks, with their support of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, they face so much backlash, so they know that their reputation is at stake. And then finally, the DLO said, if we shift to free range farming, there's not enough manpower. First, I think they tell you up top there's rapidly increasing population, which means more labor. This is a direct contradiction. Second, with 75 years, I think we can definitely have innovation for even if you don't buy the lab-grown plant-based alternatives, we can have innovation for just more effective free-range farming. Before I go on to CO, I'll take opening.
Your extension and pending effects of climate change has existed for the past few decades. If people still can't make the switch off straws, why would they make the switch off meat in general?
But I agree that it has existed, but the degree, the extent, the magnitude is completely different, right? With 75 years down the road, climate change, if people don't do anything, if governments don't do anything, it will become more proximate, which is the mechanisms that Maya gave you. Okay, on CO, they think that if countries just default to chicken, that will win them the debate. First, I think just cross-applying the OG mech that, with chicken virus, the health concern is really real. Prices of chicken, of eggs are also rising right now. Second, this doesn't really defeat our extension about the global south being that, more climately aware and knowing that this could harm them adversely. This could harm them the most if there's more factory farming, even with chicken. They won't be incentivized to go into this. And third, I think just pointing out that the motion says by 1/2. So even if there's still some chicken factory farming, that's fine. Then they give you whole reasons about how like lab-grown meat won't succeed. About perception, I think our extension uniquely beats this because it will taste better. You'll be more incentivized to eat and buy lab-grown meat when you don't have the guilt. And this guilt will only compound and only accumulate when you feel the climate change effects, when the climate change effects are more adversely impacting other people around the world and not just like a distant illusion, right? And secondly, most of these lab-grown meat are actually biologically meat. If my specs are correct, most of them like take cells from meat, etc. So like I don't think the taste part is as big of a thing. They tell you that it's dominated by Western people. They have these weird cage-free labels. I think with more climate activism, again cross-applying our extension, there will be more whistleblowers to bring account to this, and companies will be less profit incentivized to do all of these bad things. And just on their extension, I think our extension completely flips it because the developing world, even with economic growth, they will only use this growth for climate mitigation, right? For these lab-grown alternatives because they know that they will be affected. They would not rather be drowned rather than, not having some meat. Proud to vote CG.
I would like to thank the speaker for that speech and call upon the whip on closing opposition.
Before my speech, I would like to thank John Big Dog Washburn, who's been my partner. And I would like to thank Tanya Chavla, the DPM from OG. Okay, first of all, I'm just going to go team by team and tell you why we place over all of them. Onto OG. We think the burden that OG Keeley misses on their point with the rise in sort of this lab-grown meat is that they fail to acknowledge the huge pushback that exists in the US against against veganism and against this lab-grown meat. We think John's told you a bit about like why probably people think this is too processed, and also we think that Kumam's point about how everyone's now just is becoming vegan is very stupid and doesn't really apply to a lot of people, and I think he's in a little woke bubble that maybe is warping his perception. We think Keeley, why this is also we think that probably the meat lobby is an incredibly powerful institution that has the ability to kill competitors in the womb, basically. We think because they're so resourced and they have been and will continue to fight off a lot of these technological developments, we don't see that this trend is going to die out. We don't see a tipping point from OG about why exactly this is going to why exactly they're going to suddenly break through the barriers that the meat lobby is placing on them. We think why first of all this is very, very important is because this impact that we give you of basically stifling this at the root in the US is very, very important because the US is probably the most technologically advanced and has the most resources then to actually try to pursue making this type of technology compared to much of the rest of the globe. And so we think in this way, because of what we told you, we basically stop it from even reaching the rest of the world in a lot of cases. Yeah, we think the US's loss of investigation into like lab-grown meat and alternatives is incredibly important for trajectory of the entire world because the US often sets cultural trends as well. Okay, on to OO. We think this is not a knife. This is just a fact that we would like to humbly state that grain, rice, and vegetables are actually far cheaper and less land demanding than meat. So we think this kind of mitigates a few of their points, but we are going to come back and even though that's true, why actually the production and the continuation of factory farming is going to probably increase exponentially and offset any of these reductions that we might see. We think that animals will need to eat crops, and we think also OO's analysis is like very unclear, and it seems like they kind of suggest that more people are going to eat plants anyway. We think that the OO case is sort of just unrealistic, and we probably give a much more positive case that works even if we believe that there is some mitigation in how much meat is being eaten in the woke West. We also explain why said wokeness probably backfires in the form of like culture wars and pushback against the development of this kind of meat. Okay, on to yeah, I'll take you.
Even if people are a little bit averse to it, lab-grown meat will be vastly cheaper than traditional meat. If you had the choice between a $20 natural steak or a $5 lab-grown one, which one would you pick?
So even if we buy that somehow this technology in the US surpasses the barriers that we have clearly told you are facing that empirically just exist, we think that because we've also told you that the places with the most exponentially growing and developing populations are going to have this newfound demand for meat, we also think that those are probably not the places that can finance this new technology that is going to be so fresh and probably expensive in the next 100 years, because it is not fully developed and they probably do not have the resources, and they're much, much farther from the places in which this technology is actually being developed. I'm going to talk a little bit more about why that's true in a bit, why we think that factory farming is probably the most likely thing outcome in all these developing countries. Okay, a little bit on CG. We think our chicken challenge kind of just flips them entirely. We think because their mechanism for how people become so averse to factory farming is this demand for like this end of climate change. We think that there are much easier alternatives for corporations to vie for, because Kaylee, they kind of, I don't know if they took chemistry, but like basically methane is kind of the driving factor of climate change from these factory farming. So to the point where you just don't farm cows and you farm things like chicken, which is like probably they're smaller and like easier to manage and don't produce this methane, then we think that easily people just don't gaff anymore. They don't care at all. And then factory farms can continue to operate, and they probably operate with exponentially more animals, because thinking cap on, if the animal is smaller, you have more of them to produce the same amount of meat. And then obviously our impact just gets multiplied. Yeah, we also think that the people that they say are the most invested in this, who are experiencing climate emergencies, probably don't have the privilege to pay for things like free range meat or more like expensive plant-based options. So we think that probably this mitigates their impact anyway. And also we think like in terms of guilt, often empathy comes from like how, I don't know, how cute the animal is. And I think people don't really gaff about chickens. They really are looked at like farm animals, like they're looked at as sustenance. People eat eggs, people eat chicken so often in so many cultures across the world. Yeah. No, actually, no, Mom. Also, on their point about antibiotics, OG said that. On health concerns, we think probably the way to reduce these health concerns is to just marginally increase the amount of space in factory farming, to basically reduce like the proximity of these animals to each other, and in turn, corporations are more likely to just make reforms and not likely to actually abolish factory farming. Okay. More expansion about why factory farming is the most likely thing in these developing countries. OG literally concedes that these developing countries are becoming probably more westernized, maybe more secular if it goes for religions that don't actually eat meat. So if they're becoming more secular, then probably they're more willing to eat meat anyway. And a big impact or a big reason why people actually eat meat is that it's protein efficient. People want to opt into this because it is an easier and cheaper way to feed their family, as opposed to trying to like eat as many like garbanzo beans or something as possible to get the same protein intake. Like it's just like factually true that this is more efficient and people will opt into this. Okay, and why do we think factory farming is probably the thing that arises in these places? We think probably it's much, much easier to establish than other like plant-based alternatives or something. And yeah, it's like much more feasible that this is the technology that then comes in to feed these exponentially growing populations. Yeah, okay. Yeah, so basically OG really does not tell us why lab-grown meat is, or they don't effectively prove to us why lab-grown meat is going to be a good alternative. They don't prove that it even gets off the ground. And we think even if they prove some margin on this, we prove that in exponentially more cases, factory farming is going to become more and more prevalent. We think yeah, they're kind of inaccurate in just how they frame everything. And we think CG's mechanisms for why people actually care about this are inaccurate and can be easily mitigated by corporations making different allowances. Thank you, and proud to oppose.
I would like to thank the speaker for that speech and everyone for the debate. We'll go